Yeah, hello everyone. Today's lecture is going to be looking at materials from chapter 18 that covers a period more or less from 1890 through 1914, and that refers to an unsettled world. And effectively, it looks at um, a world that has been produced by forces that were unleashed in previous periods that we've sort of gone over, but I'd like to sort of review and sort of connect them up in the review with materials in the chapter itself, right? So the first force is the Industrial Revolution. And I have tried to sort of emphasize the multifaceted aspects of the Industrial Revolution and its impact on society, on humanity, on human destiny, on our relationship to the globe, to the environment, to each other, the many forces that it itself has unleashed, right? And so we looked at the Industrial Revolution sort of in a focused way by looking at it as um, a process that changes the nature of the production of commodities in society. Commodities are objects produced specifically for sale in the marketplace. Manufacturing then becomes the mode. Factory based systems of manufacturing are, if you will, the starting point and the trampoline that's going to spring us into many other changes that are associated with it. Um, so certainly the the mass production that will be one of the results coming out of the Industrial Revolution um, is going to sort of rapidly expand society's need for resources. Resources in a number of different ways. One is materials themselves, materials like cotton and rubber and other kinds of sort of um, naturally produced materials. Um, Things like coltagens, like cotton, that are um, produced in plantation formation to feed the needs of the mills that are beginning to grow and expand, and plus to feed now the growing consumer demand out there. The other kinds of materials will be scarce. Resources, certainly in this area, the growth of energy, the need for energy sources, that's going to go through a series of sort of iterations. And, certainly the first is water power. And water power has obvious restrictions to it, but it was a first attempt to sort of, shall we say, funnel an external natural source of energy into the human process of production, in which required some initial engineering skills, some ingenuity, some imagination, all of which were sort of tied to the natural flow of water in the rivers, which then has aspects of seasonality, where the rivers rise and fall. And so water wheels, which are the basis for extracting the kinetic energy in water that's flowing downstream, um, are sort of fixed at a certain height. They've often got, if you will, little canalways that funnel the river water through them, make them turn. They take that circular energy, pass it into, into the factory itself, right? Which then begins to sort of make, you know, it will enable machines to sort of very, very primitive early machines that if we were to see them today, we might really say that these things look terribly primitive, but they are the first step in the direction of sort of tying um, systems of power and energy in nature um, rather than extracting as humanity has done uh, up till um, up to the growth of agriculture, extracting the fruits of nature directly. Then, with the growth of agriculture, there's that sort of great leap forward, the emergence of population growth, large scale societies, the need for states, um, all of those kinds of things. Then, with the Industrial Revolution, there's another even greater step forward in terms of um, humanity's control over force and power in nature that is going to sort of impact directly on nature in our need for energy and materials, labor power, other kinds of things, right? And so we saw how, starting with water power in rivers, the invention of the steam engine will then enable, it has a lot of different changes associated with it. One of the first things is combustibles. We need combustible fuel sources. Wood was the earliest fuel source that was used. Gradually, then, a transfer to coal, which was a much more efficient. It burns at a higher temperature, burns for a longer period of time inside the steam engine. We then begin to get systems of transportation, the railroad, steamboats. Uh, so there are advances that come um, out of the Industrial Revolution that will sort of piggyback on it and indeed make like a snowball effect so that more and more aspects of society get incorporated into it. And so the Industrial Revolution is related to much of the stuff that follows here. Um, and one of the things I would like to sort of um, emphasize here is the interconnectedness of these sort of, for analytical purposes, isolated movements like the Industrial Revolution, like imperialism. So the relationship between the Industrial Revolution and imperialism is both direct and complex. It's direct because the Industrial Revolution unleashes a need for resources. As we said, a country like England will, the beginning country for the Industrial Revolution, is a relatively small country with restricted amounts of resources, but enough to get the process started, but then quickly looking beyond its own boundaries for other sources of raw materials, right? So, for example, the slave plantations in the south of the United States will become a primary source of cotton for the mills in Manchester that are beginning to mass produce cotton dresses and shirts and other kinds of things, cotton cloth for whatever purposes, for sheets on beds or whatever it is, right? But for a growing global market, right? When the Civil War starts fighting, the English are going to turn to two areas where they have begun to sort of penetrate those societies. Egypt is one, India is the other, and this the need on the part of the industrial factories back home in England for these scarce resources is going to have a direct impact on society, particularly to the extent that the British have mechanisms of control in those societies, as it were. Um, so, what is imperialism? Imperialism is more or less the movement in the second half of the 19th century um, in which Western European powers that have begun the Industrial Revolution are able to use the advantages that the Industrial Revolution have for them in strategic and specific areas. Certainly, we spoke about transportation, right? And what good is it going to be to colonize if you cannot transport the materials that you want from the countries that you are colonizing? But that's just part of it. The first and most strategic area here is the mass production of weapons of war of an advanced form by the West and the factories of the West are really what's going to make possible the expansion of imperialism that occurs at this particular point in time. You know, without cannons, without machine guns or Gatling guns, whatever, without rifles, um, sophisticated forms of rifle, but also now increasingly more modern forms of communication, um, transportation, or all of these will feed in and make imperialism possible and possibly necessary for those countries, right, that are going to practice imperialism to try and gain contact over land and resources. And so what they're looking for are resources, labor power, and markets. And in the process, they'll be colonizing people along the way. Um, so, Industrial Revolution, imperialism, nationalism. So we've just had uh, nationalism and imperialism in the chapter that we've just been through. So that nationalism is the growth of the nation state, which to most of us growing up in today's world seems almost like a given, if you will, a natural phenomenon in the world of politics, in the way the earth is divided up into political entities, each of them a nation with their own system of government and things like that. And certainly, the nation state, as we understand it in the modern world, is a product of Western Europe from the time of 1469, when Ferdinand and Isabel get married and create modern Spain, continue and finish the process of the Reconquest. England, 1485, the end of the War of the Roses. You get a united England with roots in 1066 and the Norman Conquest. But certainly at that point in time, at the end of the War of Roses, with the Tudor dynasty, you have the true unification of a modern state of England. France, similarly, during that period of time, is going to evolve coming out of the Hundred Years' War. And so you have these things. And indeed, in the period that we're looking at, certainly recently in this course, the unification of Italy and Germany takes that process of national growth and development, the consolidation of a nation around a specific ethnic group of people speaking a language, having often religious similarities, a history of a unified history of social process and development over time. Nationalism then feeds into the Industrial Revolution because we are looking at Europe specifically, but it's going to spread elsewhere. Europe specifically, at this particular point in time, is really a period where there is immense competition between nations, and particularly as we've seen, the rulers of those nations, particularly in monarchies, right? One fighting another for control, if you will. And In this context of competitive nationalism that ultimately is going to lead to World War I and the explosion of competitive nationalism in Europe and around the world, um, in this particular context, the emergent dynamism of the Industrial Revolution um, pits one nation's industrial might against another nation's industrial might. Quite clearly, if you look at the whole issue of uh, the military and the military's capacity to both defend the borders, boundaries, um, the sovereignty of any individual nation state, that's going to soon be very quickly tied to the industrial production of weapons of war. Um, and so the resources needed to produce gunpowder and the iron and the other materials needed to produce the weapons themselves and all of these things suddenly become not just market-based items, commodities for sale, but strategic items. Strategic in the sense that they help to ensure the survival of the state and the citizens in the state that are protected by the state. And increasingly, then, that bleeds over into this insanity of imperialism in the 19th century. And the idea being that um, if I don't, if my country, yeah, if we don't in our country go out and grab as much of the globe's resources, we will quickly find ourselves overwhelmed by our traditional enemies who have done what we failed to do, right? And so this creates sort of like a crazy race, which is most clearly seen in the events in Berlin in 1884 and 1885, where the Kaiser invites other Western powers, England, France specifically, but Spain and Portugal, Italy are invited as well, to meet together in Berlin um, to literally carve up the map of Africa for their own purposes, right? And so one thing feeds into another, which feeds into this whole question of nationalism, which then turns around and feeds into imperialism and is part of the Industrial Revolution and the competition for resources, markets, and other items as well, right? Now, so we have the industrial. These are the forces that have been unleashed already in the world over a period of time, right? So from 1729, when the first steam engine is made, all the way through into the Napoleonic Wars and then the peace that follows, and the expanding the economic expansion that follows it. So that's the Industrial Revolution. Imperialism then, has aspects of it at different points in time. We looked already at the whole question of the penetration of Chinese society, in the form first of opium that is brought by um, Brits and others. The Turks are growing it and selling it as well. But the Brits initially, Americans will get involved, the Germans and the French will get involved. French will come in through Vietnam. The Germans will try and develop their own cities that'll become strategically German cities, right? Um, so you have imperialism, um, industrial revolution, imperialism, nationalism, and the last of the four different um, movements or processes from the last century or so that have sort of helped create this um, world in anxiety, this unsettled world, are resistance movements that had already begun to spring up um, in response to the emergent powers of the West that are, flexing their muscles at the expense of either tribal societies, different parts of the world, even traditional empires like China, like India, parts of India as well. Um, so, um, very, very quickly to review them, in Africa, for example, although there are several of them listed on the map in the textbook that show the explosion of sort of resistance of different forms, the Fulani revolt in northern Nigeria, led by Osman Danfodio, is one of the um, more important because it really sort of helps to create a political organization and a socio-cultural movement in that country. We're a very, very small group of people in northern Nigeria, Kano and Kaduna, cities in the north. Osman Danfodio will actually go to Saudi Arabia, um, get influenced by conservative forms of Islam that are reacting there to the impact of Western society. And he will come back and create then his own sort of Islamic society covering large parts of northern Nigeria, such that today Nigeria is still in the north Muslim for the most part, based on the events that occurred there. There is the Shaka Zulu uprising. So the Fulani uprising in Nigeria has a date of 1804 to 1817, the start of the 19th century, right? Again, fears that religious purity is being lost in the Shaka Zulu revolt. There is this sense of impending Western forces, particularly in South Africa, where the Shaka Zulu uprising occurs, and where Shaka Zulu, the chief of this movement, puts together a powerful armed force that will resist penetration for quite a number of years. And that dates from 1787 to 1828. In Arabia, we have Abdul Wahab, and Abdul Wahab is the sort of the leader of a conservative Muslim movement, a sort of a return to the source, to the origins, to return to a purified form of Islam rather than an Islam that is being influenced by the intrusion of alcohol and other kinds of influences from the outside world. And Wahhabism becomes a powerful movement in Saudi Arabia and will leave as a residue, the formation of the um, Ibn Saud family, the Saud family, which is the ruling family in Saudi Arabia. Very, very powerful group, still sort of siding with extreme forms of Islam, out of the Wahhabi school, yet at the same time trying to westernize Saudi Arabia in some respects. Women can now drive. There's a women's college there. There's stuff going on there that is kind of expanding and changing and modernizing Saudi Arabian society, yet at the same time walking a tightrope to try and keep the sort of very conservative mullah class of the priestly class of Saudi Arabia from rising up in rebellion. China and India then represent the sort of penetration of previously sort of sovereign, large-scale societies on their own suddenly being penetrated by the force of commercialization first, such that countries like Portugal, like France and England begin to set up trading centers that will evolve into cities that today are some of the larger cities in India itself, but very quickly, given, first of all, that competitive nationalism that we've seen already, certainly between England and France, they will both be sort of vying to try and control what the English will call the jewel in the crown, the most valuable colonial possession. Once 1858, the English have driven out the French and now sort of remove the East India Company that had been sort of expanding its control and literally turning India into the colony of a monopoly system of trade in the East India Company. But the rebellion of 1857, of 1858 then will literally remove the East India Company and make India then a crown colony of the Queen of England, Queen Victoria at that particular point in time, but of the royal family. In China, on the other hand, if you recall, in 1839 to 1842, that penetration of opium had really begun to undermine the viability of Chinese society, particularly in the southern half of China. So the northern half of China, where indeed the Manchus, right, in Beijing exercise much greater control, they will sort of slightly before that, in the 1830s, send an army down to sort of destroy the opium and sort of drive out the trading class that's there. English traders go back to England, go to Parliament, demand that Parliament defends their rights to trade in China, even though they're trading drugs that are destroying the viability of Chinese societies. The English come back with a fleet of ships that are steam driven, have massive cannons on them, can go up the rivers, break the chains that the Chinese had put across the rivers to prevent them from going upstream, and literally will sort of confront the imperial capital once the British fleet gains access to the Grand Canal, which is the system for transporting food that has been contributed in taxes to the royal capital. And so the possibility of them being starved out, right? And they then come to an agreement. And that agreement gives the British Hong Kong, which they will develop. It's basically a barren rock when they get it, but it's going to be their sort of um, staging ground when boats arrive, when other boats bring them materials to be traded to them, right? Um, they get that, but they also get, God, what's the term? They have free access now to travel in China, and once this happens, British missionaries will begin to penetrate China. We saw what had happened, you know, um, at the start of the 17th century, after the Battle of Tekigahara, and the shogun takes over Japan and then decides that Christians can't be trusted, crucifies 100,000 Christians, Japanese who had been converted to Christianity, right? The Chinese are facing something um, similar here. Um, so the 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 missionaries begin to arrive and begin to expand different parts. Other European powers, like the Germans, like the United States, demand free entry into the Chinese market. China is suddenly overwhelmed by foreigners who go there with, now I remember, extraterritoriality, which is kind of like the same rights that um, diplomats to the United Nations have in this country, that they are not liable to the laws of this country, to a certain extent, right? That diplomats sort of can only be judged in courts of their own country, right? And so suddenly you had these, you know, Europeans, English, French, German, um, Portuguese, spreading out, doing what they want, and bringing with them their own prejudices and their own religious prejudices, and spreading their beliefs, which from the point of view of Christianity, Buddhism is, maybe it's a philosophy, right? But it's certainly not a religion, and these kinds of things go on there. And so we had the Taiping Rebellion from 1851 to 1864, which literally, the heartland, the central regions of China, um, have fallen to the control of a man who has had dreams of being somehow related to Jesus Christ, and bringing a new vision of life, and reforming Chinese society, but also throwing out foreigners and all this kind of stuff, right? This is preceding the period that we're coming up to. So we have all of these forces, the force of production, the search for resources, the rape of the planet, the quest for what we need wherever it is. And as I said, what they're looking for are resources, laborers, labor power, workers, and markets, places to sell their products to. So now, these forces in the period that we're looking at from 1890 to 1914, and indeed beyond, we could say, certainly that's the case, World War I doesn't end this process. These forces created a world divided between a global economic expansion, as we've been saying, right, in which the movement of goods, commodities, ideas, religious ideas, other ideas, science, and armies. So goods, ideas, and armies are moving, were linking together. This movement had as a result a process of linking together the world's peoples in unprecedented ways, so that globally somehow the whole world is becoming interconnected, right? Something that we can certainly understand from our own perspective today, because that process has, if anything, just exploded in the recent world, such that a disease that starts in the streets of Wuhan in China, before you know it, is here, is in Europe, is in South America, is in India, right? And we're all struggling to come to terms with it, right? Yeah, at the same time that this incredible economic interconnection is occurring, tied to evolving systems of production that are filling the marketplaces with commodities, and some people are getting very, very wealthy, and some societies are getting wealthy, and the standard of living is changing. At the same time that that's happening, though, um, many of the world's citizens, in this interconnected global society, were becoming deeply dissatisfied with the global inequalities that they could see emerging in terms of wealth and power, and indeed the loss of sovereignty on the parts of their own societies and their own people. Okay, now the chapter that we're looking at, chapter 18, ties these anxieties and insecurities to several key factors. Then, first is the uprooting of people from the countryside to the city, um, rural to urban flight, and as well as the movement of people from one continent to another. So you have movements inside countries, in which the growth of manufacturing centers in urban areas will act as magnets to draw people out of the countryside, where it's getting more and more difficult to maintain a style of life commensurate with what appears to be the possibilities that are opening up in the urban environment. And then, as one continent, like China, begins to get overwhelmed, both overwhelmed by outsiders and undermined in terms of its own ability to control its society and its way of life, you get people leaving there. And so there are massive amounts of people leaving China and going elsewhere as well. The second thing, so there are four here key factors related to these insecurities. One is the migration of peoples around the globe, and migrations are going to take different forms in different areas and respond to different imperatives back home. Second thing is a growing sense of discontent with the poverty that many people are suffering at the same time that economic production and the production of wealth have continued to increase and done so rather rapidly, so that people are seeing that they're being left behind, right? Okay. And it's certainly going to be one of the things that will motivate some people to migrate. People leaving Europe to come to the Americas, right? But that sense of discontent can also um, be enhanced by the by the presence of radical ideas, the growth of socialism, as we've already seen. When we're looking at this stuff already, right? But other kinds of religious and others, certainly the impact of Islam on events um, from 2001 to the present, right? And certainly even before that, but that a religion as such can be a motivating factor to increase the sense of discontent and the willingness for individuals, as we have seen close at hand, to sacrifice their lives to promote a religious ideal and changes in society. The next thing is a frustration that will be building in different societies with the incomplete expansion of rights within nation states, um, tied to an incomplete realization of national aspirations. What does this mean? Well, certainly the growth of the suffragette movement is tied to a growing sense of frustration within the ranks of women in industrializing and modernizing societies in Europe and the United States, elsewhere in different parts of the world as well. Similarly, in this country, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Well, then listen to, what a Martin Luther King can do with those words when he holds them up to the society, and says, what's going on here? Several years ago, our history symposium was dedicated to a variety of themes that led up to well, in any case, I gave a presentation on the impact of World War I on race relations in this country, and what happened when Afro-American soldiers who had fought, some had died, some were given medals as heroes, came back to this country that they had fought to defend, and discovered that the country was unwilling to render them the respect that they deserved as veterans, but also the rights that they also deserved, the full rights that they deserved as citizens, right? And this will lead to uprisings and rebellions and things like that, and massacres, some of which were hidden from the population, don't appear in our history books that we are now resurrecting, in a sense, right? So that frustrated realization of the incomplete realization of national aspirations in that form, we are still the Black Lives Matter movement is indeed confronting the fact that we still have not finished the revolution that we began to create a society based on laws and based on the full rights of citizenship for all our members. Finally, in places like Asia and Africa, there is a growing resentment of and a resistance to European domination. Certainly in Africa, we've already seen this in a sense, in the Taiping Rebellion, which was also a reaction to a sort of external ruling group in the form of the Manchus of the Qing dynasty, but also in regard to the growing presence of Europeans in Chinese society. We're certainly going to see this explode in the Boxer Rebellion right at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, right? In Africa, certainly you're going to see this in parts of North Africa once they get colonized, and there will be the growth of resistance there in different areas throughout Africa. Then there will be Mau Mau rebellions in Kenya. There will be, things that occur throughout the continent. Okay. Okay, so I want to look at a topic that the textbook refers to as progress, upheaval, and movement. And movement is the movement of people, right? People in motion, effectively, migrations during this period of time. So if political, economic, and cultural changes, as we've just seen, could unsettle the world, so could mass migrations of people. I mean, look at all the chaos and confusion we've seen at the so-called southern border, where groups of first Mexicans, then Central Americans, have been trying to gain entrance into this country, and the degree of sort of political turmoil that it's caused. Well, similarly, in Europe today, the movement of people out of Syria, right? Okay, with the wars that we've been fighting in Syria, right? The movement of people out of places like Iran, Iraq, and other kinds of countries where warfare has reigned and things like that. And the whole question of where do they go? Who takes them, right? People coming out of North Africa into places like Greece and Italy and southern Spain, and whose responsibility is we still have this stuff today, right? There was something called the Caucasian tsunami, named by Alfred Crosby, the historian who gave us the Columbian Exchange, the concept of the Columbian Exchange. And the Caucasian tsunami, with this term, he's referring to a massive emigration outflow of Europeans from a number of different countries and over different periods of time to North America, right? Italians arriving in New York, giving us Little Italy, arriving in places like Australia, Argentina, Buenos Aires has its own Little Italy. Was the number two after the United States in terms of source country. Indeed, it received more people from Spain and Portugal there because they felt more at home with the culture that was there. And at that particular point in time, Argentina was seen as a country as developed as the United States was, right? Europeans are going then to Africa, to Cuba, to the Caribbean, Africa, certainly Kenya, the highlands of Kenya. Italians will be going to Ethiopia. There'll be Europeans going to different parts of North Africa as well. Certainly North Africa will be invaded with them. South Asians out of India and out of parts of China will then leave and go into Malaysia, Burma, Indonesia, East Africa, the Caribbean. I was in the Peace Corps and I went to Trinidad, Tobago for training, and I was literally assigned to a family, right? Trinidad is a fascinating place with a large transplanted Indian Pakistani, perhaps Bangladeshi population, because they were all part of the Indian colony that extended from Pakistan through Bangladesh. And the British brought them as workers to a place like Trinidad. And you go there today and you have this bizarre mixture of island people and people who have been brought in from Asia. Um, Most of these people were recruited to labor on plantations, railways, mines, difficult kind of work, right? After all, they helped us build the um, the Trans-Pacific Railroad, right? That crosses America out of Chicago all the way out to the West Coast. We had Chinese workers on the lines building them, right? Um, Often these groups were followed by merchants. When I was in the Peace Corps in West Africa, having trained in Trinidad and St. Croix in the Virgin Islands, um, I discovered in places like Ghana that shops would be run by Lebanese merchants who had come in. And so the merchants often followed the laborers who went in there. The problems that are going to occur in China, as we see with the Taiping rebellion and the subsequent events that occur there, forced their own large scale emigration, right? Industrial change also caused internal migrations where rural dwellers seeking employment in cities began moving in, right? Migration, of course, was risky both internally and externally, right? But in the end, it could be rewarding, right? So it continued to stimulate people who got involved in it. Um, Many people went on these trips. Many, for example, the Italians who came um, to um, to New York in the 1880s, the 1890s, the start of the 20th century. Many of them returned back to Italy again. People came with the idea, I can go to America, I can work for a while, save up money, 3, 4, 5 years, take my money, return, open a shop in my hometown, right? This kind of a thing. Get that initial capital that I need to do what I'm planning to do, right? And what happened there was the outbreak of World War One. German U-boats made it possible for people to travel back and forth. And so the fact that people come here for 2 years and then return to Italy stopped. And what happens is when you are forced to remain in a place for that amount of time, your perspective changes. You begin to develop roots. You get married. You have kids. The kids are here, and this I've seen with the Dominican Republic community we have here in Port Jeff. Right, people came with the idea of returning, but when they decided to return, their kids say, "No, we're Americans now. We go to school here. I don't want to go back to the Dominican Republic. I'll go back there on vacation, but I don't want to live there." Right, this kind of a thing. Right. Okay, let's quickly then. Um, Urban life it has its own problems and issues. First thing is going to be housing shortages, right? Masses of people arriving in urban centers, right? And this despite government's attempts to, through projects and city planning, to make life more amenable for people. Modern amenities did not make much of a difference for the majority of the newly arriving immigrants. For the vast majority of city dwellers, these people tended to work long hours for long wages and lived in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions. Um, the sense of changing identities with migration, entry into new countries, emergent nationalism, all of these things. And then children going to the schools and learning the languages and things like that, right? All of this stuff is unsettling and unsettling populations at this particular point in time. Okay, that's probably longer than I want it to be. Thanks a lot, guys. I'll continue with this material.